A special welcome to our listeners today. My name is Janinha Piazzetta, and this is the H3 Pink Ribbon podcast. Our goal is to inform and support all breast cancer patients, survivors, and their loved ones regarding the latest information and resources related to breast cancer diagnosis, treatment, and long-term survivorship. The H3 Pink Ribbon podcast is part of the intense education work of H3 Health, Hope, Healing, a nonprofit education organization based in Miami Beach, Florida, of which I am the founder and director. H3's mission is to provide breast cancer education, awareness, and support. Today is the second episode of our Pink Ribbon podcast. In this exciting episode, we will continue the theme of miracles. Our topic for today is the possibility of long-term remission, perhaps even a cure for some forms of metastatic breast cancer. Today, we will discuss immunotherapy and how it works for breast cancer treatment. First, let's discuss what we mean by immunotherapy. This information is a direct quote from cancerresearch.org. Cancer immunotherapy, also known as immuno-oncology, is a form of cancer treatment that uses the power of the body's own immune system to prevent, control, and eliminate cancer. One powerful part of our immune system is our T cells. T cells are white blood cells that have the ability to recognize foreign particles like bacteria, viruses, and even cancer, and can kill cells that are infected. As you all see, it's very complex, right? Now that you, the audience, understand the basics of T-cell immunotherapy treatment, I want to introduce you to our special guest today. We are very excited to have as our special guest Judy Perkins, who is the first person to be cured of breast cancer using T-cell immunotherapy, another living miracle. I met Judy Perkins in April 2022 at the National Breast Cancer Coalition Summit in Washington, D.C., where we were both, and still are, NBCC advocates and part of the Florida delegation. Together, we went to Capitol Hill, urging our politicians to pass important laws, especially for patients with metastatic cancer in need of disability insurance. Her force, her experience, and willingness to help is amazing. Judy was dying of metastatic breast cancer in 2015. Her treatment was no longer working, and she was without hope when she sought out an immunotherapy clinical trial and became one of the first breast cancer subjects. As a result, she's considered the first person to be cured of her metastatic breast cancer through immunotherapy. Truly an amazing breast cancer miracle. It's an honor to have you as our guest today for our second Pink Ribbon podcast episode. Hello, Judy. Thank you for accepting my invitation to be our guest today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Judy, tell us your story from the beginning when you were first diagnosed and what your prognosis was at the time. Tell us about your experiences with the treatment.
So I was first diagnosed with breast cancer in 2003. I was 38 then, and I had ductal carcinoma in situ, which I was told is stage 0 or even precancerous. I had a mastectomy on my left side, and I had no chemotherapy and no radiation. And so in pretty short order, I was back at work, had put breast cancer behind me, didn't think about it much at all. and thought I was done with it until it came back 10 years later.
So it came back 10 years later, let's say 2013. Is that when your cancer came back? And this time it was metastatic stage 4.
Correct.
What parts of your body was affected? Where was the tumor? Can you tell us, please?
So I had a tumor on my left side. It felt like a lump in one of my lymph nodes in my upper left chest, and it took me a while to get it diagnosed. But when they finally sorted it all out, I had a big tumor underneath my sternum that was starting to go into the bone, and I had some other smaller tumors throughout my upper left chest, mostly in my lymph nodes.
So this time, the standard treatment options like chemotherapy and target therapies were not working. You also mentioned that you had a problem with the oncologist who gave you chemo, and that seems to be the wrong move for your type of cancer at that time. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I had ER positive, HER2 negative cancer. So that I think about 70% of us have that subtype. And I just went to my local oncologist. I didn't know very much about breast cancer at the time. It was before I started learning things. And so my local oncologist was concerned about the size of my tumors. So he started me on IV chemotherapy. So then I got in touch with some other advocates who taught me a little bit more and urged me to get to a comprehensive cancer center, which was how I eventually got myself down to the University of Miami. And they have a breast cancer oncology unit where they specifically treat breast cancer. So when I finally got my oncologist there, he wondered why I was even on chemotherapy, wondered why I hadn't started with hormonal therapy. Because that's usually how breast cancer, even stage 4 breast cancer, is treated. We're no longer going for the cure. We're trying to have a good quality of life for as long as we can. So we start with the treatments with the fewest side effects and then work our way up to the IV chemo. But, he did, even though he questioned why I had done it that way, he did sort of tell me that it doesn't really matter. You're going to get these treatments, and what order you get them in isn't really totally agreed on by all oncologists.
So it's not about a choice or the wrong move or a different oncologist. It just happened to you. On that note, what would you tell our audience, that the ones that maybe be in the same situation that you were, in terms of making a choice, choosing the right treatment, the right oncologist?
Well, I've spoken with a lot of people, and basically the advantage of a place like University of Miami was it had access to the best doctors who knew the best treatments that were available. Now, sometimes the treatment that they recommended could be delivered by my local oncologist, who was 5 or 10 minutes from my house, whereas going a long distance, I was happy to go down there for a clinical trial that I couldn't get locally. But the nice thing about the Comprehensive Cancer Center was I could get a second opinion. I could basically back check my local oncologist and make sure I was getting what I should get, or, that I agreed with the plan. And in the cases where standard treatment was what I was on, then it was nice to get it closer to home. If there was something that the cancer center could give me that the local onc couldn't do, then it was good to have that option too.
How far were you from University of Miami back then?
I went to Deerfield Beach, was about an hour and a half from my house.
Oh, that's pretty close. So what was your reaction of all this happening, First, the treatment wasn't the right one. Then you arrived, you found University of Miami, the breast cancer department the clinical trials. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience, please?
So when I first started the chemotherapy, I had pretty high hopes that I might get a complete response. I had never had any systemic therapy, so I thought, since I was sort of a newbie and all that, that maybe it would be really effective and just stamp out my cancer. But after about 4 months, it became obvious that that was not happening, and my oncologist at the University of Miami said, hey, the average time that a treatment works is about 7 months, and then every treatment after that works for less and less time. So that was kind of his rule of thumb. Even though we are all different, there are some averages out there. So it became obvious that my 4-month success was really as long as I was going to have, and the subsequent treatments worked for shorter and shorter periods of time. And finally, I did qualify for a clinical trial at the University of Miami. That did buy me some time. It wasn't a home run hit, but it worked for a little bit. And then finally, the side effects got so severe, I had to discontinue and had advancement of my disease. So that was the point that I found the clinical trial at the NIH through Dr. Goff and NBCC.
So in 2015, you learned when your cancer came back about immunotherapy trial at the National Cancer Institute, which is part of the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. So how did you learn it through? Where did you learn and how? Was it NBCC or NIH? Where did you learn?
I had actually heard a news report where they had cured somebody with a glioblastoma using a similar T-cell type therapy. So I had had my antenna up for a long time, and I had even looked online for clinical trials because it sure sounded like a great thing to try. And I was never able to find anything for breast cancer. So it wasn't until I was at Project LEAD, which I think you've taken as well, the National Breast Cancer.
Yes.
Yeah, the National Breast Cancer Coalition sponsors this for advocates. It's a 1-week-long intensive breast cancer science training designed to bring advocates up to speed so that when we're involved with research grant reviews or helping to push legislation and speaking with legislators, we know what we're talking about so we can be more effective at what we do. So at any rate, I was at that conference, and Dr. Goff, who's a member of the clinical trial team, Dr. Steven Rosenberg's team at the NIH, she was teaching immunology. Just how your immune system works, the real basic nuts and bolts of how your immune system works, and a little bit of how that's relevant to cancer, but even more basic how it works and just protecting us from bacteria and viruses and just all the different parts of the immune system. At the end of the class, she just happened to mention that she had this clinical trial going, and my ears perked up, and after dinner I corralled her over a beer and got more information out of her, and it turned out that I was a good fit for that trial. So I applied, and I was in the trial a couple of weeks later.
What was your reaction of all of this happening back then, Judy?
It's a pretty heavy hit to find out you've got stage 4 cancer. So I think at first I was hopeful that the chemotherapy would work for me because I had never had any systemic treatment. So I was really hopeful that I would be one of those unusual complete responses and, have more life than I was supposed to have. My oncologist had told me that I probably had about 3 years, and if I hadn't gotten into that clinical trial, I think that was a pretty good estimate. So having stage 4 cancer is a bit of a roller coaster. You have bad news, you sort of absorb that bad news, you discover a new normal, you kind of get comfortable with your new normal, then you have a scan, you find out your treatment's not working, so you get hit again. And that just keeps happening to you, and you have a few
Wow.
years to just deal with this.
Judy, could you go into more details about Project Lead?
Every year they have a training called Project Lead, which is for breast cancer advocates. It's basically a week of breast cancer science, everything, epidemiology, biology, immunology, politics. It's a crash course so that when we're at the table, we know what we're talking about. And because I was dealing with stage 4 cancer, I was very invested in finding out everything I could about breast cancer. It was a much different experience than my early stage breast cancer experience. I wanted to know everything I could about my disease. And then as I realized that I was probably not going to live very long, I wanted to do what I could to help other people who were dealing with this. So I was involved with support groups, and the National Breast Cancer Coalition was really good for me because they're very focused on the science and facts and, using real vetted information to try and make a difference in this.
They're amazing, amazing. And I hope to see you again in May in Washington, D.C. for the summit.
I will be there.
It's a great opportunity where which all of us meet the researchers, the scientists, the doctors, the politicians, and we have even a chance to go to Capitol Hill and urge the politicians to pass some laws for metastatic patients. So it's a wonderful thing, National Breast Cancer Coalition. But going back to the immunotherapy trial, how does it work? Could you explain to the H3's audience a little bit more in depth? It's amazing.
So I found out about the trial at Project Lead, and Dr. Stephanie Goff was teaching us about immunology, and at the end of the class was when she mentioned the trial. And the way she's explained it to me is that basically they remove a tumor, and out of that tumor they get some white blood cells that recognize your cancer. Now, you need a quick refresher on how white blood cells, but most of us know that, say, if you cut your finger, the white blood cells are going to come in and, cure your infection. They're going to fight the bacteria. So why don't those white blood cells work in cancer? And that's what this trial is trying to make work. So it turns out that inside the tumor, there are some cells that recognize the cancer. But the problem is that the cancer is really good at making those cells think everything's okay and that they shouldn't ramp up an attack. So what they do is they harvest these cells and they multiply them outside the body into a big IV bag full of 90 billion of these specific cells that recognize my specific cancer mutation, so it's very personalized. And then right before they give me those cells, they gave me high-dose chemotherapy, which knocked out all the rest of my immune system. So there was nothing else happening in my body that might confuse these cells. And then they infused those cells into me, and their only job was to find the cancer and attack. And that's what they did.
And what are the requirements to be part of this clinical trial?
So one of the problems for breast cancer patients is that many of us have bone-only disease where the cancer is metastasized to our bones. And in order to be eligible for this particular trial, you have to have at least 2 tumors, one of which has to be resectable, that they can operate and cut it out, and that's where they're going to harvest the T cells. And the other tumor, they need to be able to watch and keep an eye on and be able to see if the treatment is working. So for a lot of cancer patients who have bone-only disease, they end up waiting until the cancer moves to the liver or the lungs where they can resect it. But the problem then is you start to get more and more sick, and it takes them about 4 months to grow your cells and get the treatment ready for you. So sometimes we're fighting getting too sick to get this treatment.
How does it feel, the treatment itself?
It's pretty hard on your body because they give you about a week of high dose chemotherapy. So they make you drink a lot of water and pee a lot because the chemotherapy is such a high dose. They don't want it even sitting in your bladder for very long. So after that, they give you your cells, and they also give you something called interleukin-2, which is essentially food for the cells. It's really good at helping those cells thrive and grow and do what they need to do. But for the patient, it makes you feel like you have the flu, like the worst flu you ever had. So it makes you feel very lethargic. I felt like I was death warmed over. And I think that's when they stop giving it to you, is just when you look so sad, they just won't give you anymore. So it's kind of a grueling treatment.
And how soon after you start to feel better back then?
So with every one of my treatments, I had a tumor in my upper left chest that I could feel. And I could always tell if a treatment was working. Usually within about 7 to 10 days, I would feel that tumor maybe get a little softer or get a little smaller, and I could tell that a treatment was working. And I had treatments that worked for 2 months, and I had treatments that maybe worked for 2 weeks or not at all. So by the time I left the NIH, which was about 10 days after I was treated, I had to wait for my white blood cell counts to come up enough so that I could go back outside and not catch a cold and die from a cold.
Wow.
So by then I started to feel that tumor get a little smaller, and I didn't know if it was because of the T-cell therapy or if it was just because of the high-dose chemotherapy. But either way, I was happy that it was shrinking a little bit because it pressed on a nerve and caused me a lot of pain that I was dealing with. So I just felt hopeful that things were moving in the right direction. But I had already had a lot of pretty serious chemotherapy. And so, within a week or two after that, I noticed that tumor just kept shrinking and disappearing. And I knew that was not chemotherapy because it was a dramatic response.
Going back to the white cells, so they take a great deal of white cells out of your body, but not all of them, right? Because I believe we need some to be able to continue functioning, right? Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
What they do is they give you high-dose chemotherapy, which knocks out all of your white blood cells, but then your bone marrow regenerates your white blood cells. So many of us, when we have chemotherapy, that's what we're watching. That's what keeps us from having more chemotherapy, is our white blood cell counts are not high enough.
Wow, you are truly a miracle, a walking miracle, and I'm so honored that I met you and I have you today for this podcast episode. And another question is, what approaches have you used to become a long-term survivor of metastatic breast cancer? Meaning after you are cured, but your life goes on. But I am pretty sure that you have to adapt new ways of dealing with life, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Basically, after you got cured and you had to go back to life again, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I told you it was a pretty difficult thing getting the news that you've got stage 4 cancer and facing your own mortality. And, it's almost the same thing in reverse when you've prepared yourself to die and circled the wagons and written your will and made a nice little room that you're going to go die in and have hospice come and take care of you. And then all of a sudden, that's not happening either. So it was weird coming back to life, and I got very involved with doing some long distance kayaking. I've kayaked around the peninsula of Florida, which is 1,200 miles, and I don't think it's all that unusual. I've talked to other people who have had similar experiences, sort of death-defying experiences with cancer or other illnesses, and somehow they all need to go run a marathon or do a 100-mile century ride on their bike. It's this coming back to life and this resurrection and getting a second chance. It's really something.
So, if you have to pinpoint what role does this experience play in your present day-to-day life, I would say second to second, minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, weeks, months, and years. How is your approach to life, towards life today, that you can say, I'm cured?
Well, I've definitely learned not to delay too many things for the future. I take my bucket list very seriously. I'm always adding new things to the bucket list and doing things on my bucket list. But, I talked about the shock and awe phase of finding out I had the cancer. There was also kind of the shock and awe phase of finding out I wasn't going to die. I didn't know how long that was going to last. So there was kind of almost like a frenzy. I was a bit fanatic about it. So I've settled back in now. I have a longer planning horizon than I had right at the beginning. I'm not quite as eager to get everything done this week. Like, I do have a longer term timeline now.
Perspective in life, basically, long term.
But I've kept my priorities. I definitely am not waiting till tomorrow to do what can be done today.
And that's a great message to all of us breast cancer survivors. And even if you are a non-cancer survivor, put yourself together with your stuff. Judy, any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
Often I'm asked what my recommendations are for people who are finding out they have metastatic breast cancer or other stage 4 cancers. And generally my advice is the same, which is to go to a comprehensive cancer center. Do not be afraid to get a second opinion so that you can really understand your diagnosis, your specifics, your mutations, if they're relevant, what exact subtypes you have. And hopefully clinical trials will be available at that cancer center. And maybe after initial treatments, clinical trials can be a good option. So investigate them and find out if they're a fit for you.
And for our listeners, if you ever need information about clinical trial, please send us an email or call us, and I'm pretty sure that we can help you finding the correct one, or at least the place in your city, in your neighborhood. Judy, it's amazing. Thank you very much for telling your story today. It's very touching and inspirational. Oh my God, thank you, thank you. As you see, we all have our unique journeys and experiences related to breast cancer. Thank you, my dear, and be safe, be well, and I hope you continue this great journey, the uplifting journey, positive journey that you are living right now, okay?
Thank you very much.
Stay tuned for our next exciting episode with our nationally renowned sexologist, Dr. Marilyn Volker, who will be speaking about sex and intimacy during and after breast cancer diagnosis. For more information about the precise date and or H3's work, please visit our website h3hope.org or email us at info@h3hope.org. Be safe, happy, and healthy. Thank you all.